All right, guys, we get to war. The firing upon of Fort Sumter inaugurated Civil War, but let's be very clear that the attack at Fort Sumter, which resulted in no loss of life other than one Confederate horse, um, that particular attack is not regarded as a battle of the Civil War. At least I do not consider it a battle of the Civil War. It is that moment in time when history sort of ruptured in on itself, when war was inaugurated, as I've mentioned it before. But whether or not you want to look at Fort Sumter as the first battle of the war, or whether it's just that thing that broke the camel's back, what it did was it brought all of that tension that we've been talking about pretty much throughout the duration of this course, but especially over the last couple weeks as we looked at the causes of the war. It really brought all of that together, and we are going to have a conflict that will last from 1861, as we can see listed here, all the way into 1865. Now, initially, as we will see, many people did not think that the Civil War was going to be a very long conflict, a very protracted conflict, one that would require thousands of men. Those who deemed that the war would be long, William Tecumseh Sherman, for instance, were deemed to be insane. That it would take lots of men and lots of life would be lost. People didn't think that was going to happen. But as we roll through this week and next week, we will see the American Civil War was not a quick conflict. Okay. All right. So what I want to do as I move on to the next slide is sort of look quickly and briefly at Lincoln's actions following the attack at Fort Sumter. So let's move forward to that. All right, so as it says here, call for volunteers. Immediately following the attack at Fort Sumter, Lincoln is going to call upon the loyal states, because remember, there have been a number of states that seceded from the Union. And once again, let's be very clear that Lincoln does not view these states as having actually left the Union. Rather, Lincoln views these southern states who have seceded as being out of their practical relation or proper relation with the Union. And so Lincoln's objective at the very start of the war is to try and bring the Confederacy back into its proper relation with the Union. Let's be very clear that Lincoln does not call on 75,000 volunteers. Lincoln is not going to institute a blockade of southern ports because he wants to free slaves. That's not what he's doing. In fact, Lincoln had said, and I can't recall if I already mentioned this, but he had said, if I have to free all the slaves in the Union, then I will do so, and if I have to free none of them, then I will do so. His objective is to preserve the Union. Now that's going to change. By the end of 1862, 1863, we will see that the war itself will demand that slaves be emancipated. But at least here in 1861, that's not the chief objective. But what Lincoln will do in order to preserve the Union is he's going to call upon 75,000 volunteers of the loyal states. Now, there are a number of states that have not yet seceded from the Union when April 12th rolls around. Virginia is one of them. Tennessee is one of them. Kentucky and Missouri are border states, and they will remain border states. They, in fact, won't secede from the Union. And that's significant, especially when we get to emancipation, to understand that there are slave states that remain loyal to the Union, and I'll explain why that is. But again, Lincoln's going to call on these 75,000 volunteers, and he's going to implement a blockade of southern ports. Okay, James McPherson, one of the most noted historians of the Civil War, wrote a book called Battle Cry of Freedom, and I want to read to you a portion from this text where he's going to talk a bit about why some of these 75,000 volunteers decided to fight. And this is important because there's this idea that, you know, those in the North were all seeking to end slavery, and that the reason why they were fighting was for this moral and just cause. And the reality is that many people in the North even those who would deem themselves to be anti-slavery people, they weren't necessarily looking for social equality. In fact, many anti-slavery people wanted to keep the West and, if possible, parts of the North open just for whites, and they didn't want blacks there. And so, part of the reason why I look at the causes for why certain people chose to fight is because, hey, they're not necessarily going to task to free slaves. Okay, McPherson writes, war fever during the months after Sumter overrode sober reflections on the purpose of the fighting. Most people on both sides took for granted the purpose and justice for their cause. Yankees believed that they battled for flag and country. Okay, that they were fighting, as he says, for their glorious institutions, for the Constitution, for the law, for the best government on earth, right? These are the things that McPherson speaks about when he looks at the letters and diaries of those Yankees who responded to the 75,000 call. They're fighting for their government. They're fighting for the Union. And indeed, this is what Lincoln was fighting for as well. Here we can see the proclamation, or a proclamation stated by the president, proclamation by the president, 75,000 volunteers and an extra session of Congress by the president of the United States. Proclamation, whereas the laws of the United States have been for some time past and now are opposed and the execution thereof obstructed. And of course, it continues to go on. But the point here is that Lincoln's initial response to Fort Sumter is to call up a group of men. Now, 75,000 volunteers is not really that many. And what this tells us is that Lincoln understands, at least at this point, his understanding of the conflict is that it's going to be quick. It's not going to be a protracted conflict. And in fact, this is what many people thought about the war, as I've already mentioned. So, Lincoln is not calling for thousands and thousands of men. Now, by the time that the first battle of the Civil War, known as the First Battle of Bull Run, by the time that it is over, towards the end of 1861, you're going to have about 1 million men who have been brought into the army. But that's because the situation had changed, it had evolved. But initially, after Fort Sumter, 75,000 seems sufficient to deal with the crisis at hand. Now, of course, Lincoln, he reserved the right, as his cabinet members would say, to make changes as was needed, and indeed he will. But we just have to understand that initially, what Lincoln is trying to do is to suppress this internal rebellion, and by bringing up 75,000, by instituting a blockade of southern ports, really what Lincoln is hoping to do is to end this internal rebellion, bring the Confederacy back into its proper relation with the United States, and basically end the conflict. Okay, but as we will see, of course, the conflict isn't going to end, and it's not going to end without mass amounts of bloodshed. In fact, current estimates put the casualty rate at above 700,000 men. And so this was a protracted conflict, one that took the lives of many, many people. Now, be mindful, as I've already mentioned, that there are a number of states who have not yet left the Union. They're called border states at this point. They are bordering the Union, and they are bordering the Confederacy, and these are states that could go either way. Okay, and so in addition to 75,000, in addition to instituting a blockade, Lincoln is also going to do some other things, which, when we think about them, they may not be legal. Okay, and I'll explain what I mean on the next slide here. So, as it says that Lincoln went beyond simply mobilizing troops and installing a blockade. One of the things that Lincoln will do is, by April 27th, 1861, Lincoln will suspend the writ of habeas corpus along the Philadelphia-Washington route. Now, this is important, and let me give you a little bit of back information here. All of you have the right to habeas corpus, and basically what that means is that you have the right to be told why you're being arrested. You have the right to a speedy trial. Okay, you can't just arbitrarily be arrested and thrown in prison. They throw away the key, right? Well, when the writ of habeas corpus is suspended, that basically means that you can be rounded up and tossed into prison without any charges levied against you. Now, initially, Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus along this Philadelphia-Washington route, and he does so as a military measure. There was troops trying to get through, there were supplies trying to get through, and pro-Confederate, sympathizers were disrupting that. And so, in order to allow for the war to go on, in order for Washington to be protected, the right to habeas corpus is suspended along that railroad line there, along the Philadelphia-Washington route, as a war measure. But eventually, Lincoln will suspend the writ of habeas corpus across the entire country. And so there definitely is abuses of power that is going on here. If you take a look at the Constitution of the United States, there is a branch of the government that has the right to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, but it's not the president. And so, the question that we have to ask ourselves here is it acceptable for Abraham Lincoln to have suspended certain civil liberties in order to protect what he was regarding as the greater ideal, the preservation of the Union? What precedent does this set? If we can violate your civil liberties in this particular situation, well, is it okay to violate your civil liberties in this other particular situation? It's unclear, right? But one of the main things that comes up when we think about Lincoln's suspension of the writ of habeas corpus is, does the Constitution apply during a time of war? Okay, and so that's one side of the argument, right? Should the Constitution not apply if there's a war going on, right? And of course that leads to potential violations of civil liberties. On the other hand, if Lincoln doesn't suspend the writ of habeas corpus, perhaps you get a lot of secessionists speak, and you have Missouri and Kentucky who are going to leave the Union, and it causes an even greater disruption, and perhaps the Union itself disappears, right? And so we get to that big question: does the ends justify the means? And that's not really a question that I can answer as a historian, but it is one that I think we need to think about. What are the ramifications of doing something like this? Okay. Obviously, Lincoln was criticized about this, although he does take it to Congress. He talks about it with Congress and says, this is what we can do. We can violate some civil liberties to potentially protect the Union. And again, that's what happens here. But this action, suspending a writ of habeas corpus, calling up 75,000 volunteers, instituting a blockade, doing all of this immediately after Pearl Harbor. I'm sorry, I've got World War II on the brain. After the attack at Fort Sumter, is going to sweep a number of other states into the Confederacy. You've got Virginia is the first to go, and then Arkansas on May 6th, Tennessee on May 7th, and North Carolina on May 20th. And so the Confederacy gains greater support. And of course, as these states secede, this is going to place even greater pressure on Lincoln to try and hold those border states together, right? He doesn't want to lose those states, as he has already lost these 3 or 4 here. And so, the war is going to progress and get even larger here as a result of this continued secession. Lincoln's going to continue to govern the nation as he had always done. And again, despite the fact that Virginia and Tennessee had left the Union, we have to understand, and I press this because I think it's so important, that Lincoln does not view them as having actually left, right? They're just outside of their proper relation. And I know that might sound like I'm beating a dead horse, as the saying goes, but I do think that that's something that has to be very much seared into our minds. Okay. All right, so the war is essentially on following the attack on Fort Sumter. And, if we were all in Vegas and we were putting bets down on who was going to win, particularly from hindsight, I think we would all put our money on the Union. And for those of you who don't know, here comes the spoiler: the Confederacy will lose this war. They are not victorious. But I think it's important, before we get into some of the military history, to think about what some of the advantages were for both sides. So let's do that now. All right, it states here that the idea often is that Union victory in this war was inevitable, and the loss of the Confederacy has been seen as what we call a romantic lost cause. The truism about this is that when we look at history from such a perspective, we call it a teleological view, right? We know what's going to happen because it already happened, right? But what we don't want to do is to think that in 1861 it was obvious to everybody that the Union was going to win. In fact, in 1861, 62, early 1863, the Confederacy is the stronger of the two armies. And even in 1864, when Lincoln's up for re-election, he thinks he's going to lose because the war isn't going well. And so, at the time that this thing is unfolding, it is not so clear cut to those who are fighting it that the Confederacy is bound to lose. Now, we know that they were bound to lose, and in some respects it was an inevitability, but that's only because that's what actually happened. Tyndall writes the following. He writes, "Shrouded in an ever-thickening mist of larger-than-life myth, the Union triumph in the Civil War has acquired an aura of inevitability. The Confederacy's fight for independence, on the other hand, has taken on the aura of a romantic lost cause, doomed from the start." But in 1861, the military situation seemed by no means so clear-cut. So the question is, what were the advantages? Okay, here we can see some of the things that would help us to believe that the Union was going to win. So, for example, the Union had a much larger population with which to draw troops from. The South had a population in 1860 of about 9 million people. 4 million of those, approximately or so, were slaves who were not going to be given arms to fight for the Confederacy. And so, when you're talking about a war that could be fought on a strategy of attrition, which is in fact how the Civil War will be fought largely in 1864 through 65, is you just simply kill as many people as you can. When you wipe out a third of Lee's army or you wipe out a third of the Confederacy, they can't replace those men. The Union can. Okay, look at manufactured goods, right? You talk about fighting a war with guns and bullets, right, and what have you. Well, the Union produces 92% of the country's manufactured goods. The South only 8%, and only a fragment of that was in heavy industry. Okay, miles of railroad track, 72% versus the Confederacy's 28%. Number of farms, 67 to 33%. Iron production, 94 to 6%. Banking, 82 to 18%. So when you take a look at these various numbers, right, a betting man would say, well, the Union's clearly going to win. There's no way that the Union can lose. But again, as mentioned already, that's not very obvious to those fighting this in 1861, 1862. The Confederacy has superior generals. They have home field advantage. And so, one of the things we have to understand is that even though the Confederacy in the end will lose, and in large part it does lose because it cannot feed its soldiers, because it cannot find shoes, because it cannot replace its bullets. I mean, according to a gentleman named John Green, he said, the fact that the Confederacy didn't have the railroads, the fact that they didn't have the industrial production made them suck at the Civil War. Well, it's kind of crass to say that, but it's sort of true. In the end, these disadvantages very much disadvantaged the Confederacy. But again, from the get-go, that could not have been seen. And in fact, though these are the advantages for the Union, the Confederacy does have advantages of their own. So, for example, it says, unlike the northern territories, the southern states had geography on their side. As we will see a little bit later, the Civil War is fought in two different theaters, an eastern theater and a western theater. And for us, we think about west as being like, Nevada and California. Well, west at that time was like, Louisiana, Alabama, okay? What we would typically think of as the South, okay? But basically, the South fought on their home turf, home field advantage, right? They knew the terrain. They could fight an offensive war, and oftentimes it's exactly how the Confederacy fought. They fought offensively, and the Union frequently was forced to fight defensively. That will change as the war progresses, especially after Ulysses S. Grant becomes commander-in-chief or general-in-chief of the Army of the Potomac. But the Confederacy has this home field advantage, and they can play offensively. They also have a tradition of having a strong military. Many of their generals had been trained at West Point, and in fact, we can see some of these generals here. We've got Robert E. Lee, who is going to ultimately take total command over the Confederacy. You've got Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Joseph E. Johnston, Pierre P.G.T. Beauregard, who you might recall fired upon Anderson at Fort Sumter. You've got John B. Hood and Albert Sidney Johnston. Also not listed here would be J.E.B. Jeb Stuart, Lee's cavalry, commanding in the cavalry, as well as his war horse, as he was called, James Longstreet. And these men were well trained. They were well prepared. And in the South, there was this tradition of having a strong military for a number of reasons. One, you might have slave revolts at any time, Indian attacks, expansionism, westward expansion, as we've seen. And so for these reasons, the Confederacy really is able to be successful. As we'll see on the next slide, the Union changed generals like you change your socks. I mean, when one didn't work, they simply switched them out for a different pair. The Confederacy, at times people were killed. So, for example, J.E.B. Jeb Stuart will be shot and killed during a cavalry charge in the war. I believe it's in 1863, 64. Stonewall Jackson will die during this conflict. So, unless someone's dying in the Confederacy, they're not necessarily changing out generals. Okay, the Union, by contrast, they have problems, right? And in fact, as we'll see here on the next slide, I'll show you just how many generals they went through. So the North struggled with finding adequate men to lead the entire Union Army, and you can see the names of the main generals that the Union Army possessed and had in command. Now, of course, these are not the only generals that the Union had. These are just your leading generals, your four-star generals, if you will, your general-in-chiefs. Okay. Well, in 1861, the Union starts with a general named Irvin McDowell. He was not prepared to fight the very first battle of the Civil War, the first battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, depending upon how you want to call it. And he fails at the Battle of Bull Run, and so therefore he will be replaced in July of 1861, and he will be replaced with a man named George B. McClellan. McClellan was a professional soldier, where McDowell had not been. In fact, one of the reasons why McDowell is replaced is because his soldiers were fleeing, they were, running away, and they were poorly trained. And so McDowell's replaced with McClellan because McClellan knows how to train and build up a military. The problem with McClellan is that he's a bit arrogant, and by a bit I mean incredibly arrogant, and he is always convinced that the enemy is much stronger than it is, that the enemy is much larger than it is, and so he doesn't necessarily engage the enemy as frequently as Lincoln would like him to. And McClellan has issues with Abraham Lincoln throughout the duration of the war. Eventually, in 1864, McClellan will run against Abraham Lincoln for the Peace Democratic Party. But he will be replaced in November 1862 after what is perceived to be a failure after the Battle of Antietam. Then you get Ambrose Burnside, who does not do well, and he's replaced in January of 1863. Joseph E. Hooker will replace him, but he will resign in June of 1863, just 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg. Then you get George G. Meade, and then he will be replaced in May of 1864 by Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Meade will continue to fight and hold the position of general, just not general-in-chief. There was some concern about Meade, especially in 1863, allowing Lee's army to retreat and to fight another day, that he was too cautious of a general, and so he's replaced with Grant. And what we will find once we get to 1864 is that Grant does not fight like the rest of these individuals. When he gets kicked down, he gets back up and he keeps going. These others tended to, pull back, retreat, what have you, to allow the enemy to, lick their wounds, so to speak. Grant doesn't fight that way. Once he puts the pressure on, he stays on. Okay, but it takes until 1864. There was pressure at various times throughout the war for Lincoln to remove Ulysses S. Grant from command, and he says, I can't do that. This man fights, and Grant, in fact, fought. But my point in all this is simply to say, one, we don't want to assume that the Confederacy was going to lose. You know, obviously, as we saw with the chart on a couple slides back, the Confederacy has a lot of disadvantages against them. And in the end, yes, those disadvantages will highly disadvantage the Confederacy, and they will significantly contribute to their downfall. But they didn't know that in 1861. But what they did know in 1861 is that they had home field advantage, they meaning the Confederacy, and as we see here, much better generals, much better generals, okay? All right, so with all that stated, let's move into looking briefly at the very first battle of the Civil War. Now, I am not a military historian, but I am obligated to say some things about certain battles. There are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of battles fought during the Civil War. We are not going to look at all of them. We're going to look at the highlights, okay? And the very first battle of that war, of the Civil War, was the First Battle of Bull Run. All right, it says the fall of Fort Sumter marked the beginning of the war, but the first major battle of the war did not take place until July 21st, 1861, with the First Battle of Bull Run, as Northerners called it, or the First Battle of Manassas, as Southerners called it. Northerners tended to name battles after nearby features, so natural features, so Bull Run Creek. Okay, hence the name First Battle of Bull Run, where the Southerners, the Confederacy, tended to name it for like nearby towns, and so you had Manassas Junction, and hence that's why they call it the First Battle of Manassas. Now we see on this image, it says Federal troops routed at Manassas Junction, Virginia, retreat in disarray after failed advance on rebel capital. Just a gist here, the First Battle of Bull Run, it's an interesting conflict because initially the Confederacy, it appears as if they're going to lose. In fact, very quickly, the Union Army takes the advantage. And in fact, at one point, Union soldiers say, hey, the war's over. Look at the rebels, they're running away. The Confederacy has lost. Some people spend some time to pick up souvenirs because they think that the war is going to be over. And again, their thinking here with the First Battle of Bull Run is that this is going to be a quick fight, and it's going to be over very quickly. In fact, the soldiers were not the only ones who thought this. You had lots of civilians who came out in, their Sunday best. They brought picnics. Some bottles of champagne were brought out so they can watch for themselves, a real battle, because no one thinks this is going to be a bloody, nasty mess. And initially, it doesn't feel like it's going to be a bloody, nasty mess. The Union victory seems assured. Well, then something new gets used in war, the railroad, and the railroad brings in reinforcements for the Confederacy. And once those reinforcements arrive, the Union victory becomes non-existent. The Confederacy is able to push back against the Union, and as I've already alluded to, Union soldiers flee and they run. And in the end, this is a Confederate victory. Now we can see about 37,000 Union troops were killed, 3,000 wounded, 35,000 killed, 1,850 or so wounded or missing on the Confederate side. So it's about equal with respects to the numbers of people who were killed or injured. Obviously, the Confederacy came out a little bit better here. But this first battle sort of really inaugurates the Civil War, but it also smashes this idea that the war was going to be quick. Okay. Now, there is a short video on Bull Run located in the course shell. I want you to pause this now and go ahead and watch that video, and then come back and pick up where you've left off. Okay. Okay, so now that you've watched that, you should have a better understanding of the First Battle of Bull Run. But the aftermath of it is this. It says, at the beginning of the First Battle of Bull Run, the Union Congress authorized a call for 500,000 more men, and at the conclusion, they called for yet another 500,000, which tells you what? It tells you that they began to understand, unlike Lincoln at the very beginning when he calls just 75,000. He now understands, hey, this is going to be a costly conflict. It says by the end of 1861, more than 500,000 men had enlisted in the Union Army. Now here on the right, we've got Major General Irvin McDowell, commander of the Union forces at the First Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run. Later, he commanded all Army posts along the Pacific coasts. McDowell will be removed as the head general, again, because he was not seen as a professional soldier in the likes that the Union needed. In fact, initially, what's interesting is that initially Abraham Lincoln offered the position of General-in-Chief to Robert E. Lee, who, as you might be aware, eventually becomes the lead general for the Confederacy, not for the Union. And the reason why Lee chooses not to take it, and eventually it's given to McDowell, is because Lee says he will not raise an army to invade his home. And this is important because what that demonstrates is that many individuals, both in the North and especially in the South, they did not view the United States as their home. They viewed their state as their home. In fact, at the start of the Civil War, many people would have viewed the United States not as the United States, but as these United States, in the plural. One of the things the Civil War will do is that it will help to solidify these United States as the United States in the singular. But I digress there. But McDowell will be replaced, and he will be replaced with McClellan. Tyndall writes the following. He says, the Battle of Bull Run demonstrated that the war would not be decided with one sudden stroke. General Winfield Scott, the 75-year-old commander of the Union armies, who was nicknamed Old Fuss and Feathers. You got to have that fun name. He had predicted as much, and now Lincoln fell back upon Scott's three-pronged anaconda strategy. In other words, Winfield Scott, among very few others, said, hey, this is going to be a long, protracted conflict. We can't just go in there with guns ablazing and hope to be successful. We have to have some kind of strategy, and Winfield Scott came up with a strategy known as the Anaconda Plan. You can see here, this is the Anaconda strategy. And so Lincoln, after the First Battle of Bull Run, says, okay, this is where we got to go. This is what we got to do. It says this strategy called first for the Union Army of the Potomac to defend Washington, D.C. and exert constant pressure on the Confederate capital at Richmond. At the same time, the Navy would blockade the southern ports and dry up the Confederacy's access to foreign goods and weapons. The final component of the plan would divide the Confederacy by invading the South along the main water routes, meaning the Mississippi, the Tennessee, and the Cumberland rivers. This strategy would slowly entwine and crush the Southern resistance like an anaconda strangling its prey. And so, again, following that First Battle of Bull Run, this is the strategy that the Union Army will initially take. Now, as mentioned, the Civil War was fought in more than one theater. It was fought in a Eastern theater and a Western theater. Okay, and at different times, there's different campaigns going on in each of these theaters. Sometimes there's things going on at the same exact time. But one of the things that happens after 1861 is that many of the conflicts that do take place, and there's nothing catastrophically major that happens in either theater at the end of 1861, early 1862. But there are some things that Ulysses S. Grant will be doing in the Western theater, but many of the conflicts that take place throughout the remainder of 1861 through 62 are naval conflicts. And so the next time we mention a major battle, it's going to be March, April of 1862, because for the most part things were somewhat quiet. In fact, the Union Army will pretty much be dormant. Not completely, obviously, but somewhat dormant for many months after the First Battle of Bull Run. Okay, and so that sort of briefly covers 1861. Obviously, it's not exhaustive. We don't have time to do an exhaustive account of every year, but that should give you a sense of how things were fought in 1861. So with that, we will move on to 1862. All right, the American Civil War, 1862. Let's just dive right into this. All right, as mentioned before, there are two theaters in the American Civil War, and this is the Western Theater. You can see that it largely encompasses most of the South, except for Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland, and parts of Pennsylvania. Many significant conflicts take place in the Western Theater. Chief among them, I would argue, is Vicksburg. If you take a look at the left-hand side there by Arkansas and Mississippi, the Battle of Vicksburg, which takes place between 1862 and 1863. Very significant. You've got in 1864 William Tecumseh Sherman's infamous March to the Sea. Okay, and we'll get to each of these conflicts, but there's quite a few. One that I will mention here briefly, the Battle of Shiloh. If you go look at Mississippi and go to the red spot where it says Shiloh 1862, this is an interesting little conflict that involved Ulysses S. Grant. Throughout the remainder of 1861 and early 1862, Grant had been somewhat victorious in both Tennessee and in Kentucky. He had scored some victories, and the Confederacy didn't do so well, and so they begin to move their troops around Corinth. In fact, you can see Corinth is just north there of the Battle of Shiloh, or where the Battle of Shiloh took place. Grant, at that particular conflict, exposes his men as he's marching, and the Confederacy capitalizes on this. And during 2 days of fighting, one day the Confederacy was victorious, and on the other day the Union was. Grant is taken by surprise here at the Battle of Shiloh, and it's a problem because what happens is, following the Battle of Shiloh, which is interesting, by the way, Shiloh is a Hebrew word meaning a place of peace. At this time, it was the costliest battle that had taken place up to that point. Of course, that will be eclipsed. I think there was something like 20,000 or so troops who died over 2 days. But Grant, who had a reputation for being drunk, will have this rumor tossed about that on the first day of battle, the Confederacy found Grant and many of his men sleeping or eating breakfast, and so they were surprise attacked. And so following the battle, there is a general named Henry Halleck who was jealous of Grant. And so he spreads this rumor that, Grant was drunk, and that's the reason for, the surprise attack, and therefore Grant needs to be removed from command. Lincoln does not want to remove him from command. Lincoln says, "I can't spare this man." He fights. But what happens is that following the Battle of Shiloh, Grant will be removed as field commander in the West, and he will be replaced by Henry Halleck. Henry Halleck will come up again, as he will eventually momentarily replace McClellan. It says here, Halleck, however, took Grant's place as field commander, and as a result, the Union thrust south ground to a halt. Remember, I had mentioned earlier that Grant fought, and he continued to fight where many other generals stopped. And so the move south that Grant had begun during the latter part of 1861, early 1862, the Battle of Shiloh sort of stalls that. At any rate, I digress a little bit there. This is the Western Theater, as you can see, but there is another theater. Let's move on. Here we see the Eastern Theater, largely Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, that kind of thing. So the heart of the Confederacy is here in the Eastern Theater. If you go down and look by the James River, it's down by the bottom right, you'll see there's a railroad that cuts right through there, right near Petersburg and Five Forks. Petersburg was an incredibly significant rail center, supply line for the capital, which was Richmond. Eventually, in 1864, 1865, the Union Army will take possession of Petersburg, and ultimately Richmond will be abandoned. But at any rate, I just wanted to give you a sense of where these conflicts were taking place. Okay. All right, let's move on. Okay, so now, as mentioned before, the latter part of 1861, 1862, there weren't major conflicts going on, at least nothing what I should say is little happened of military significance in the Eastern Theater between 1861 and 1862, and a handful of things happened in the Western Theater, Grant specifically in Kentucky and Tennessee. But one of the things that will happen in March of 1862 is you get this Battle of the Ironclads, or more appropriately called the Battle of Hampton Roads. It states that the Battle of Hampton Roads was the most noted and arguably most important naval battle of the war from the standpoint of the development of navies. Prior to this, all of your ships were wooden ships, but these particular ships, the Merrimack and the Monitor, respectively called, became iron ships. And many of the developments on these particular ships, and you can actually see one of those here, the Monitor, we're talking about numerous patentable inventions. When we think about the American Civil War, we want to understand that the Industrial Revolution propelled this war forward in many significant ways, and the development of these ironclad ships, and the one you're looking at here is the Monitor. That was the ship for the Union. The Merrimack was the ship for the Confederacy. They revolutionized the technology of the day, and this particular ship, the Monitor, only had 2 guns compared, I think the Merrimack had 10. But the Monitor's guns, you can see if you look at this picture, if you look at that sort of circular cheese box looking thing on the top of the ship, it's on a turret, which means it rotates. And so, 2 guns to the 10 on the Merrimack may not seem like an advantage, but the fact that it can spin gave it somewhat of an advantage. Now, the Battle of Hampton Roads was fought over 2 days, March 8th through 9th, 1862, and it was part of the effort of the Confederacy to break the Union blockade, which had cut off Virginia's largest cities, Norfolk and Richmond, from international trade. And I mean, that's one of the point of using a blockade. I mean, the South doesn't have the ability to supply its own needs, and so it's dependent upon trade. Well, the blockade is shutting some of that off. Okay. Tyndall writes the following things. He says, "The one great threat to the Union Navy's blockade of southern ports proved to be short-lived. The Confederates in Norfolk, Virginia, fashioned an ironclad ship from an abandoned Union steam frigate known as the Merrimack. Rechristened the Virginia, it ventured out on March 8, 1862, and began attacking Union ships. And the reality is that for one day, the Merrimack was the king of the sea, because when the Merrimack would fire at these wooden ships, they would blow them to pieces. But when those ships would fire back, the cannon would just bounce right off the side of the Merrimack, because they've got these iron plates. And so for one day, right, the Confederacy is the king of the sea. And then the next day, the Monitor shows up, and you get this epic battle. It says, "But as luck would have it, a new Union ironclad, the Monitor, arrived from New York in time to engage the Virginia on the next day. They fought to a draw." Ultimately, the Confederacy will blow their ship up rather than surrender it. And so I guess in some ways you could say that in the end the Union wins. But as far as the Battle of Hampton Roads goes, it is a draw. But this is one of those climactic, interesting battles that takes place. We don't think about naval conflicts so much during the Civil War, but this is an example of one of those things. It says, "Therefore, or thereafter, the Union Navy tightened its grip on southern ports. In late 1861, a federal flotilla appeared at Port Royal, south of Charleston, pounded the fortifications to submission, and seized the port and nearby Sea Islands." Basically, what you've got with this Battle of Ironclads and the Navy thereafter is just a stroke of ingenuity and major changes to the Navy itself. So that's one of the main reasons why I wanted to at least mention this. All right, let's move on. All right, so as I had mentioned before, the Army of the Potomac, or the Union Army of the North, following the first Battle of Bull Run, the Army was basically dormant for quite some time, and part of that had to do with the building up of the Army. McClellan, as you might recall, he will take control over the Union Army following McDowell's removal, and McClellan will spend much time fashioning for himself a professional army. And eventually, Lincoln gets antsy. He wants to have the Union engage the Confederacy. and end this conflict. And so around the same time that the Battle of Hampton Roads takes place, McClellan will begin on a campaign known as the Peninsular Campaign. It says the Peninsular Campaign, fought during the spring and summer of 1862, was an attempt by McClellan to capture the Confederate capital at Richmond from the southeast. Pressured by Lincoln to mount an offensive, Union forces had been dormant since the previous July, McClellan moved his Army of the Potomac down the Chesapeake Bay, landed it at Fort Monroe, and then marched it up the peninsula between the James and York rivers. And basically what his objective is, McClellan's objective, is to capture Richmond and ultimately, hopefully, cause the Confederacy to stumble and to back off. Tyndall writes, "This bold move put the Union forces within 60 miles of the Confederate capital. Thousands of Richmond residents fled the city in panic, but McClellan waited to strike, failing to capitalize on his advantages." And this is important. He gets to Fort Monroe, and if he had just pushed in towards Richmond, he probably could have ended the Civil War here, or at least he could have significantly damaged the Confederacy's ability to fight. But what McClellan does time and time and time again is he waits, he waits, he waits. And as a result, he's going to have to engage in a slugfest over these 60 miles. Let's move on to the next slide. Here we see a map of the Peninsular Campaign. You can see Fort Monroe at the very bottom there where it says Hampton Roads. You can see Fort Monroe. That's where he lands. And then it's McClellan's hope to move from Fort Monroe at Hampton up towards Richmond, which you can see is about 60 miles or so up the James and York River. And he's going to engage the Confederacy in a number of different battles. I'm not going to go into each of these, although the one that you probably need to be somewhat aware of is the Battle of Seven Pines, May 31st through June 1st. You can see that is just towards the top of the map here, just below the Battle of Hanover Courthouse. You can see the Battle of Seven Pines. Now, the reason why the Battle of Seven Pines is so important is because in that conflict, a general by the name of General Joseph E. Johnston, who was kind of the lead general in 1862, he gets wounded. His troops take on heavy casualties, and he is shot and wounded. He's not killed by any means, but he is wounded, and as a result of the Battle of Seven Pines, Joseph E. Johnston will be replaced by Robert E. Lee, who will assume command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Okay, but again, I'm not going to get into each of these particular conflicts. Again, I'm not a military historian, but in the end, this Peninsula Campaign is not successful. Eventually, McClellan will be asked to pull back and out of this area by Lincoln and Henry Halleck. Perhaps if McClellan had attacked faster, sooner, taken his advantage, maybe he could have done something, but he doesn't. Okay. All right, as already mentioned, it says Johnston was wounded during the Battle of Seven Pines, and Lee took command of Confederate forces. Tyndall writes the following. He says, "Dignified yet fiery, Lee was an audacious commander. He led by example." Okay, and his men loved him. It says the first of Lee's attacks, or counterattacks, if you will, occurred on June 26th, and after 2 days of fighting, Lee forced McClellan to abandon his supply line and begin a retreat back to the James River. And in the end, the Peninsular Campaign is not successful. It's not successful at all. It says on July 9th, when Abraham Lincoln visited McClellan's headquarters, the general complained that the Lincoln administration had failed to support him adequately, and this is the reason why the Peninsular Campaign failed. McClellan is not necessarily Lincoln's biggest fan. He refers to Lincoln as a well-intentioned baboon. He's not a big fan, and so here, after the failure of the campaign, he basically tells Lincoln, hey, the reason why I wasn't successful is because you guys didn't support us well enough. Tyndall goes on to state, such insubordination was ample reason to remove McClellan. Lincoln returned to Washington, and on July 11th, he called Henry Halleck from the West to take charge as general-in-chief. Now remember, Henry Halleck had been that individual who was jealous of Ulysses S. Grant, spread the rumor after the Battle of Shiloh that Grant had been drunk. This is how he becomes lead commander in the Western Theater. Now, after the Peninsular Campaign and after McClellan just sort of lays into Lincoln, Henry Halleck will now be brought in to replace McClellan as general-in-chief. And of course, McClellan doesn't like Henry Halleck. He says that McClellan says that Halleck is an officer whom he knew to be his inferior, but in the end it doesn't matter because McClellan, although not completely demoted, and he's still a general and he will still be fighting, he is removed as general-in-chief, and Henry Halleck will be given that title. Okay. All right, let's move on. Okay, a couple more battles I do want to take a look at because they are significant, and I'll try to get through these more quickly. But the Second Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, this also takes place in 1862. And there's a couple of things that we need to be aware of. First, this proves to be the deciding battle in the Civil War campaign waged between the Union and Confederate armies in Northern Virginia in 1862. Now, some things you need to be aware of before the Second Battle of Bull Run happens is that in July of 1862, as I just mentioned, Henry Halleck was appointed as the new commander-in-chief of the Union armies, and that's due in part to McClellan's failure in the Peninsular Campaign and, of course, his tongue-lashing to Lincoln. And then Lincoln and Halleck decided to recall the Army of the Potomac, which was being led by McClellan. They called them back to Washington, and they are going to unite that particular army with the newly formed Army of Virginia, then under the command of John Pope. And the idea here is that they want to make a massive strike against Richmond. It says that at the Second Battle of Bull Run, fought on almost the same site as the earlier battle, John Pope assumed that he faced only Stonewall Jackson, but Lee's main army by that time had joined in. On August 30th, a crushing attack on Pope's flank drove the Federals from the field. In the next few days, the Union forces pulled back to Washington, where McClellan once again took command and reorganized. He displayed his unflagging egotism in a letter to his wife, where he says, quote, "Again I have been called upon to save the country." The disgraced Pope was dispatched to Minnesota to fight indigenous populations, to fight Indians. And in the end, the Second Battle of Bull Run is going to be a Confederate victory, just as the first was. And, what's interesting is that it's unclear who's to really blame for this. Is it John Pope's fault? Is it Henry Halleck's fault? Is it McClellan's fault? Whose fault is it? Ultimately, it doesn't really matter whose fault it was, because in the end, the Confederacy is victorious at the Second Battle of Bull Run. And this is a strategic maneuver by Lee, which not only helps to relieve pressure from the Peninsular Campaign, effectively ending it, right? But it also helps to keep the Union from being able to attack Richmond. I mean, that was the point of combining Pope's and McClellan's armies together. It says, despite heavy Confederate casualties, 9,000, the Battle of Second Bull Run was a decisive victory for the rebels, as Lee, pictured below to the left, had managed a strategic offensive against an enemy force, Pope and McClellan, and you can see McClellan there to the right, twice the size of his own. It says, on September 17th, the two generals, Lee and McClellan, would clash at the Battle of Antietam. And the Battle of Antietam, also referred to as the Battle of Sharpsburg, is an incredibly significant conflict. And the reason for it is many, but practically, as far as slavery is concerned, the Battle of Antietam convinces Abraham Lincoln, who by this point, because it's getting close to the end of 1862, the war's been on now for a little over a year, year and a half. By the end of 1862, Lincoln is beginning to recognize that there might be a need to emancipate the slaves, not because he's necessarily becoming, overly moralistic about it, although we can clearly say that Lincoln was anti-slavery. He did not want to see slavery extend. But Lincoln's beginning to recognize that slavery is allowing the Confederacy to continue to thrive. And eventually, an Emancipation Proclamation will be issued at the end of 1862. It will go into effect in 1863. And it is issued largely as a military measure. Okay, and I'll be talking about that here in a second. But the war throughout 1861-1862 has not been going well, as we have seen. Most of the battles have either been fought to a draw, or the Confederacy has been the better of the two armies. And so Lincoln is looking for some kind of victory that can boost morale, that can give him support so that he can issue an Emancipation Proclamation. And the Battle of Antietam promises to be that battle. Okay, what basically happens is that Lee had sent Stonewall Jackson and part of his army off to Richmond, as I understand it, and he is writing a letter to his commanding officers, and he's written this letter out to them, and he's wrapped it around in a cigar, put it in a cigar box, and sent it off for transit. Well, along the way, the cigar box is dropped, and the Union picks up the cigar box, McClellan, sorry, I had a moment there. McClellan knows the strength of the Confederate Army. He knows that Stonewall Jackson was sent off to Virginia, Harper's Ferry, by the way, correction there. And McClellan has this letter that basically tells him everything he needs to know. And if he attacks, he can end it. He could destroy the Confederacy right then, right there, and this will bring a war to an end. In fact, he says, quote, "Here's a paper with which if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home. But here's the problem. Instead of immediately attacking, McClellan does what he did at Peninsular Campaign. He waits. About 16 hours he waits, believing that the enemy was stronger than it actually was. Of course, those 16 hours were crucial because it gave the Confederacy an opportunity to reassemble most of their army, and they will reassemble that army behind Antietam Creek. And so rather than having a massive victory, really what you're going to get is just a minor victory for the Union. Okay, but despite waiting 16 hours, they're going to go ahead with it anyways. It says, still optimistic, both McClellan and Lincoln decided to go ahead with the attack. On September 17, 1862, the Union Army attacked the Confederate lines. It says the Confederate lines were falling apart, but they soon received reinforcements from A.P. Hill's division, who plunged into the action, attacking the Union Army's left flank. Number 2-1, the Confederates were still able to fight the Union Army to a standoff. Basically, to a standoff. And, you know, here was that moment when the Union could have destroyed the Confederacy, but they don't. Tyndall writes the following. He says, the Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single day in American history. Some 6,400 soldiers on both sides were killed and another 15,000 wounded. Surveying the battlefield afterward, a Union officer counted, quote, hundreds of dead bodies lying in rows and in piles. The scene was sickening, harrowing, horrible. Oh, what a terrible sight. And here we can see some of those men who died. Photography was a fairly new art form at this point, but photographs allowed for people to be able to see the carnage of the war. And I mean, the thing with the Civil War is that, you know, today if we had 10% casualty rates in a battle, we would be considered a bloodbath. Here they had 20-30% casualty rates, one after another. And you know, the carnage of the war was just horrific, and a lot of that had to do with technological changes that had taken place. Rifling, for example, was new at this point in time, where before you were fighting with smoothbore muskets, and you know that didn't allow for the bullet to spin, and your range wasn't very good. Well, the mini ball, which as it went through the barrel of the gun, now with the rifling allowed that bullet to spin much as you would have like on a football spiral, and it allowed you to have greater accuracy and longer range, and just the amount of technology that changed at this time changed the way the war was fought. In fact, that's why this week we have an extra credit assignment on technology in the Civil War. So, but yeah, here's an image from that particular battle. Here is another. Now, what's interesting, or rather ironic, or horrible, depending on how you want to look at it, is that McClellan thinks that he's done a splendid little job. In fact, he says that he had fought the battle splendidly, and he said that his victory was more than complete. I think based upon these images, we would argue that his victory was not more than complete, and in fact, the Confederacy survived to fight another day. So on the whole, McClellan thought he had done a splendid job and that his victory was more than complete. Lincoln did not see it that way. No decisive victory could be claimed. The battle had been fought to a draw. Okay? There's no way that you could say this. It says, disgusted by McClellan's failure to gain a truly decisive victory, President Lincoln sent him a curt message to the general saying, quote, I have just read your dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done that fatigues them anything? In other words, he's saying, look, you've done nothing. You did nothing. He's removed from command, McClellan was, and sent to New Jersey to do recruiting. He never commanded troops in the field thereafter. Tyndall writes, the Battle of Antietam was the turning point in the war. It revived sagging Northern morale. It emboldened Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all the slaves in the Confederate States, and dashed the Confederacy's hopes of a foreign recognition. Yet the war was far from over. In his search for a fighting general, Lincoln now made the worst choice of all. He turned to Ambrose E. Burnside, who had twice before turned down the job on the grounds that he felt unfit for so large a command. And indeed, McClellan will be replaced with Burnside, and Burnside will lose horrifically the Battle of Fredericksburg, and then he will therefore be replaced later as well. Okay, now I'm not going to get into the Battle of Fredericksburg, but just recognize that Burnside loses and does not do well there. Okay. All right. Perhaps the most significant thing to come out of the Civil War was the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, remember, the war began under the premise that Lincoln wanted to restore the Union, not to free the slaves. Okay. In fact, Tyndall writes, several considerations kept Lincoln from issuing an Emancipation Proclamation. For one thing, Lincoln had to cope with the deep-seated racial prejudice in the North. Okay, many abolitionists may have wanted social equality for blacks and whites, but many anti-slavery folks did not. But over time, the war changes Lincoln's position on freeing the slaves. Tyndall goes on to state that to save the Union, Lincoln finally decided emancipation of Confederate slaves would be required for several reasons. Now, let's be very clear that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued largely out of military necessity. Okay? Out of military necessity. It does not free the slaves in the entirety of the Union. It only frees slaves in those states that should be in a state of rebellion against the Union. So in 1862, Lincoln basically issues this Emancipation Proclamation, and it says that on January 1st, 1863, those slaves in the states that are presently at war or in rebellion with the Union, they will be forever free. It does not free slaves that are in the Union. That would include Missouri and Kentucky, as well as Maryland and Delaware. It also does not free slaves in Union-held territories, as you can see those pictured here in yellow. Okay, so we have to be very clear that the Emancipation Proclamation does not free the slaves in the whole of the Union. Yes, there were still slaves in the Union during the Civil War. This does not apply to them. One of the things we have to understand about the Emancipation Proclamation is that it is issued out of military necessity. Think about this. He issues it in 1862, tells people, okay, that in 1863, once 1863, January of 1863 rolls around, those states that are in a state of rebellion, your slaves will be free. This is strategic. One of the things that Lincoln is hoping to do is to goad Southerners back into the Union, right? If on January 1st, 1863, Tennessee or North Carolina or Arkansas rejoined the Union, then their slaves would not go free. It only concerned those slaves in the states that were in a state of rebellion. So if Georgia and South Carolina, at the end of 1862 said, all right, we're done, we're no longer part of the Confederacy, come January 1st, 1863, their slaves would not have been freed. This is a military measure, okay? And it's incredibly important, okay? It's incredibly important. What were the reasons besides that Lincoln issued emancipation? According to Tyndall, slave labor bolstered the rebel war effort. Sagging morale in the North needed the boost of a moral cause, and public opinion was swinging toward emancipation as the war dragged on. Proclaiming a war on slavery, moreover, would end forever any chance that France or Britain would support the Confederacy. That was one of the things that the South was really hoping to do, was to gain some type of an alliance with both France and Britain. Well, both those nations, particularly Britain, had already ended slavery. And so it's very strategic for Lincoln to issue this, okay? By issuing the Emancipation in 1862, saying it goes into effect in 1863, Lincoln's hoping that some of these states, if not all of them, will end their internal rebellion and rejoin the Union, and therefore their slaves won't be freed. There's military necessity, number one. Number two, by making the war not about Union but about slavery, means that foreign alliances are not likely to happen, because once the war becomes about slavery, Britain and France aren't going to support the Confederacy, because they can't support a nation that's going to try and fight a war to preserve slavery. Three, it's military necessity. Once you free the slaves, that's going to help break the economy of the South. Not to mention that many slaves began to flee from their plantations and began to move into the North, and the Union is going to begin to use these slaves as troops. You see, the Emancipation Proclamation is a military necessity. It says in July 1862, Lincoln first confided to his cabinet that he was considering issuing a proclamation that, under his powers, would free the slaves. At the time, Secretary of State William Seward advised him to wait for a Union victory, and of course that came after the Battle of Antietam. On September 22nd, 1862, 5 days after Lee's Confederates had been forced to retreat from Maryland, Lincoln issued a proclamation in which he repeated that his object was mainly to restore the Union and that he favored proposals for paying slaveholders for their losses. But the main burden of the document was his warning that on January 1st, 1863, all slaves in the rebel states would be forever free. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln urged blacks to abstain from violence except in self-defense, and he added that free blacks would now be received into the armed services of the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation is incredibly important. It doesn't free a single slave. Be aware of that. It does not free a single slave, but what it does do is it helps to change the purpose of the war. Now we are fighting for something higher. It ennobles the war, okay? Now, 1863 is going to roll around, and emancipation will be put into place. All right, as before, that doesn't necessarily exhaust everything that could be said about 1862, but it should give you an overview. Just real briefly, we're just going to finish up here by looking at two final slides in 1863, and mainly we're going to be looking at the consequences, or one of the consequences, of the issuance of the Emancipation. So, and if you have not yet done so, there is a video, it's an interactive web page that covers the Battle of Antietam. Before you move on to the next slide, go through and watch the conclusion of that. I think there's about 6 different sections. You're free to watch them all, of course, but I am asking that you at least watch the conclusions, because although we've already talked a bit about the outcomes of the Battle of Antietam, specifically with the Emancipation Proclamation. There are other things. So please watch that and then get into this final section. All right, having watched that video on Antietam, let's now move on. It says the Union disaster at Fredericksburg, which you might recall I mentioned earlier to you with respects to Ambrose E. Burnside. It says the Union disaster at Fredericksburg in December 1862 under the command of Burnside led Lincoln to change yet again his commanding general. By 1863, Joseph Hooker, nicknamed Fighting Joe, and one of Burnside's former lieutenants, was given command of Union forces. By mid-year 1863, Hooker would prove no better a commander, and he would lose at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Okay, so that's another major change that happens. We're going to continue to change generals. But perhaps one of the largest changes to take place in early 1863 was that following the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln and the Union are going to allow for black troops to be formed in the Union. And they are going to use black troops, many of whom were free blacks, some of which were freed slaves. And the use of these troops is important. One of the things we need to understand is that just because black troops are being used doesn't mean that people all of a sudden in the North were all for equality. In fact, McPherson writes the following. He says, the recruitment of black soldiers did not produce an instantaneous change in Northern racial attitudes. Indeed, to some degree, it intensified the Democratic backlash against emancipation. The black regiments reflected the Jim Crow mores of the society that they lived in. In fact, although these black troops, the very first among them being the 54th Massachusetts, although they were made up of all black troops, they were not paid the same as white regiments. The 54th Massachusetts, among other black regiments, could not be officed by black men. They had to be officed, or the officers were white, and they were referred to in derogatory names and generally seen as inferior. But the 54th Massachusetts, among other black regiments, and I focus on the 54th Massachusetts because they were the first, it demonstrates the changing nature of the war. It demonstrates that something significant has shifted. This is now not just a war about Union. It's a war about something else. And, of course, following the Battle of Gettysburg, which will take place in 1863, and we'll talk about that next week, following that, we get a sense of what that new purpose is when Lincoln gives his Gettysburg Address. Okay, but what I want to do is just end here briefly by looking at the 54th Massachusetts. All right, it says early in February 1863, the abolitionist governor John A. Andrews of Massachusetts issued the Civil War's first call for black soldiers. Massachusetts did not have many African American residents, but by the time the 54th Infantry Regiment headed off to training camp 2 weeks later, more than 1,000 men had volunteered, including 2 of Frederick Douglass's children. Now, to lead the 54th Massachusetts, Governor Andrew chose a man by the name of Robert Gould Shaw. He unfortunately will not live to see the end of the Civil War. He is killed at Fort Wagner, which took place in July of 1863. But the Shaw family was a fairly prominent abolitionist family. He's 25 years old, and Shaw is going to have his career move forward by taking command over the 54th Massachusetts. Okay, and the 54th would not have existed had it not been for the Emancipation Proclamation. This is a very tangible consequence of that Emancipation Proclamation. Okay. All right, guys, that brings us to an end of this particular lecture. One of the last things I'd like for you to do is to watch the film on the 54th Massachusetts. And, of course, all of this content will be necessary for you to answer this week's discussion board. So watch that video on the 54th and then get your discussion board question in. All right, guys, with that, I will ask you to go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you, live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a great week, guys.